Oh, good. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to St. George's Talks, a monthly lecture series live from a historic German church in London's East End. Guten Abend und willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen in St. Georg's Gespräche. That's my little bit of German at the start of the tour to make a connection with this historic building built by a German community of sugar bakers in the 18th century. A historic building, grade 2 listed, grade 2 star listed. I'm the chair of the committee looking after secular events which happen here, talks and concerts mainly. My name is Rick Jones. During lockdown, 4 years ago now, we went virtual and now present the talks to both a real audience here at St. George's and a virtual one at home in their pyjamas, as is the custom. Themes reflect the history of St. George's, which was once the hub of a community of German 18th century migrant workers who raised funds in 1763 to build this place. It's hardly changed since then and still has all its old box pews, its creaky galleries, its memorials in German language, and its ancient wheezy organ. Our speaker this evening is a manufacturer of ancient instruments, of lutes to be specific, in their great variety, but especially those by German makers who were peerless in the 16th century. Research for this quite esoteric work is done by viewing in museums the originals, consulting old instruction manuals, and most importantly, by studying the paintings which depict the instruments. And so our speaker also is a singular authority on art, as readers of his articles in journals of the Lute Society will readily attest. Indeed, our speaker's first deliberation 50 years ago was titled Albrecht Dürer, Angel with a Lute. So there is no one better suited to an illustrated lecture on the artist than my guest, and I invite you now to welcome, please, both live and Zooming, our St. George's speaker for tonight, the president of the Lute Society, David Van Edwards.
But now I need to get rid of the screen which shows me.
We'll just share your screen. Right, there we go. Screen share. Oh, sorry, I have to enable screen share.
Dürer, of course, was famous for being on top of the latest communications, the printing of his age. So
yep.
We're following in his footsteps.
So now, is it desktop 1 that you need to share? That's 2, isn't it? So let's share that one. Oh, first allow it. I'm afraid it wants your password again.
What? Oh, right. Good heavens. Right.
Right, let's hope that this works. It seems to be working.
Well, yes, but I can't see what I'm needing to see. Right. I think that's it. Yes. Well, hello. At last. I will just flick on to the next screen to check that we are working. Are we working? Nothing is happening. Well, there is, yes. Dürer was 25, and on his second trip to Venice, he was already famous, but mostly for engravings. Sorry, my voice is very croaky today, but mostly for engravings and woodcuts. He really hadn't, his notoriety hadn't spread for paintings, but he'd come, he was a citizen of Nuremberg. He was 25. He'd come via Augsburg, where he'd stayed with the Fuggers, and he was staying in a fancy house belonging to the Fuggers in Venice. The confraternity, oh, sorry. Oh, it is working again now, good. He was commissioned by the confraternity of the Fondatio dei Tedeschi in Venice, which is circled there on your screen, right by the Rialto Bridge. It was a kind of palazzo cum warehouse that the German community, which was extensive in Venice, was using as their center. And their church was the one in front of it. Just you can see with a spire there. I think I can put, no, yes, I can there. That red dot shows the spire. Nowadays it's been changed to a kind of onion dome job, but then this was a woodcut from 1500 done by Jacopo Barbari, and Dürer would have known this because he had moved to Nuremberg, and in fact Dürer did know him. He said that he wanted to have instructions about perspective, but the only person he'd been able to contact was Jacopo, his friend in Nuremberg. But so the two confraternities that existed in the Fondatio, one was from Nuremberg and the other was from Augsburg, controlled by the Fuggers. So in a way, they combined to commission the painting. And it was the painting to go in the church, more or less as a kind of advertisement for the German community. But it was also a diplomatic statement, because at the time, the Venetians were very suspicious of this German community. Think about it, they were a foreign enterprise, mostly multinational. They were trading all over the world, but there was a particular emphasis on loot making in Venice at the time with the German community. They had moved from southern Germany over the Alps to effectively what was riches and also kind of security in Venice. And they'd set up there in northern Italy and were making a large amount of money. They were really very successful. One of the people that I investigated was Moises Tiefenbrücker, and at his the inventory after his death showed him having 300 lutes in production and ready, and 24,000 lute ribs, all of which will have been imported over the Alps. They were ewe lute ribs, which was a speciality of the Venetian German makers. And it was a very tight-knit community. They used their own lawyers. They kept themselves to themselves. And so the Venetians were somewhat suspicious of them. And so they kept spying on them, and they kept asking questions. Did they pay their taxes? Were they behaving properly? Were they exporting? Were they saying where they were exporting to? Because they were in fact exporting all over the world. The customs references in London show that the lutes from Venice were worth 4 times as much as the lutes from Füssen, which is the southern area where they had originated from, these German makers. So the Venetians were really quite suspicious of them. And if you think about the modern equivalent, it is, does Amazon pay its taxes? What's it doing? Because it was with a global supply network. There were woods being imported from South America. This is 1600 later, and woods being imported and ivory being imported, and then the products being transformed. So, and the other thing was that the Venetians were worried at that time about the encroachment of the emperor Maximilian I and the coming sort of dispute between he and the Pope Julius II. So it seemed like a kind of political act. I used to think this was Dürer's invention, but I now think this was impossible. He would have been commissioned to make this particular painting by the German community, a political statement to show their standing aside from the diplomatic problems that were surrounding Venice. So this is a Rosencrantz picture. It was a Brotherhood of the Rosary, a confraternity founded in 1474, and it was designed to illustrate the idea of a universal brotherhood of Christianity. And so it shows the clergy led by the Pope on your left, and the laity led by Maximilian, and all under the rich and poor receiving garlands of red and white roses under an enthroned Madonna. So it's not just seen as divided into clergy and laity, it's also seen as divided into Germans and Italians. So the Germans, with in fact Dürer in the painting, have got the Alps and a kind of German architecture on the left, and on the right, a much more verdant landscape and all the clergy. So it's a kind of vision of religious harmony. And it was obviously a convenient symbolism for the German colony in Venice, who were trying to maintain their independence from the conflict between the Pope and Emperor, because they were under suspicion. So it was designed in that church, which is now the church with the onion dome, and there in the foreground is the Fondatio, which had just been built by the time Dürer had arrived in 1506. It had been destroyed by fire, and it had just been rebuilt. And if I go back to no, I won't, I'll go on. So the route, this was the primary route, the Via Claudia Augusta, and it goes from southern Germany, from Augsburg, and this is the route that Dürer will have undertaken. It's also the route that all the raw materials for these lutes were imported over the Alps to Venice from the German community around Füssen, where they were cutting the wood and planing it and packing it up in barrels to be sent over the Alps to Venice, where they were being assembled into high-class lutes. There was a lot of dispute because the Germans were all running an industry in Füssen as well. And so there were complaints that the best wood was getting sent over to Venice, and they were being kept with the inadequate supplies. And in fact, there was a funny tale because they got the yew was a resource from the area, and the lute makers took out an injunction against a Dutchman who was exporting yew logs because it was being used for longbows. That was the other big use for yew logs. And it was ideal for the longbow, which was a major arms industry. And so it being a major arms industry, of course, it paid better than lute making. So there was always the temptation to smuggle this wood out via a Dutch wood dealer, and the lute makers got together and got an injunction to stop this trade happening. And then one of their own number broke ranks and was caught on the border with 4 wagon loads of yew logs going to the market, and he was drummed out of the guild. But you can see the sort of journey it was. I put in the sort of the heights of the journey as well, because it's quite an undertaking. but it was the major route from Europe to Italy. And going back to the painting, there is Dürer on the left-hand side holding a sheet saying, in translation, Albrecht Dürer, a German, executed this in 5 months, 1506. He must have had permission to have this vainglorious addition to an altarpiece. And you realize that, in fact, this was a kind of showpiece. This was German confraternities highlighting a German industry with the lute, because it wasn't just a religious thing. He was partly copying Bellini, who had put lutes prominently in the centerpieces of his altarpiece.
Because it's picking up this, the light from behind you, makes you look just like a silhouette.
All right. Is that better? Right. Sorry, where was I?
Bellini.
Bellini, yes. So the lute in the center is as much a bit of product placement as it is a religious symbolism. And it was a political painting with a product placement, and he is advertising himself as the great artist who can do this in 5 months. And indeed, it was fantastically successful. The next picture, but he was partly bankrolled by his very close friend, Willibald Pirkheimer. They were born more or less in the same year in Nuremberg. Dürer's father, who was a goldsmith and artist, rented his building from Pirkheimer's father, Johannes Pirkheimer, Dr. Johannes Pirkheimer, who was a really prominent Nuremberg figure. And Dürer and young Willibald were born more or less in the same year and grew up together and remained close friends for the whole of their lives. It's really rather fine. And Willibald Pirkheimer was rich and highly educated and influential, and he loaned money to Dürer to make this journey across to Venice, the second journey. And he was rewarded with this series of very funny letters back. They are really wonderful. The sort of tone of mockery, really. My picture, The Rose Gardens, if you must know, says it would give a ducat for you to see it. It is well painted and beautifully coloured. I've earned much praise, but little profit in it. By the time it took to paint it, I could have easily earned 200 ducats, and now I've declined much work so that I can come home. And I've stopped the mouths of all the painters who used to say that I was good at engraving, but as to painting, I didn't know how to handle my colours. Now everyone says they have never seen such beautiful colours. And in fact, he'd been warned by some of his friends that he shouldn't eat with the painters in Venice, lest he be poisoned. It was quite... so the rivalry was intense. And the letter goes on, item, my French mantle greets you, and my Italian overcoat too. You can see he's a very snappy dresser. If I go back to that, I mean, look at that wonderful coat. Item, oh yes, item, you stink so much of whores. This is to his friend, his close friend, Pirkheimer. You stink so much of whores that it seems to me I can smell it from here. When you go courting, they tell me here you pretend to be no more than 25 years old. Huh, double that and I'll believe it. He was 25 years old. Dürer was 25 years old. They knew perfectly well. So the point was that he didn't... God's body, there are so many Italians here that look exactly like you. I don't know how that happened. And we'll go on to see. Item, the Doge and the Patriarch also have seen my picture. Here with me, let me commend myself to you as your servant. I must really go to sleep, as it is striking the 7th hour of the night, and I've already written to the prior of the Augustinians, to my father-in-law, to the Dietrich woman, and my wife, and they're all whole sheets full. So I have to hurry over this letter, read it according to the sense. You would doubtless do better if you were writing to a lot of princes, because he was very well connected. So Pirkheimer would have been writing to a lot of princes. And then later on, a second letter. I shall have finished here in 10 days. After that, I should like to ride to Bologna to learn the secrets of the art of perspective, which a man is willing to teach me. I should stay there 8 or 10 days and then return to Venice. After that, I shall come with the next messenger. How I shall freeze after this sun. Here I'm a gentleman, at home only a parasite. And this is Pirkheimer. You can see he wasn't a picture of, he wasn't a greatly attractive man. And they were this is him in 1503. And then there was a medal, 1517, based on a drawing by Dürer. And then towards the end of their lives, a wonderful engraving, a portrait. He did a couple of really fine portraits of Pirkheimer and of Melanchthon, the theologian. And although it doesn't look flattering, Pirkheimer was really pleased with it, and he was given the plate so that he could produce lots of copies, and he used it as his own book plate. So in spite of the mockery and the sort of criticism and the sense that he's always being made fun of, they remained absolute friends. So what I wanted to emphasize in the course of this really is it starts out with this very impressive painting, Dürer moving in a high level, being employed by important German patrons, and yet underneath it, there's a very human, rather subversive, rather critical person who you can see in the letters to Pirkheimer. And I think you can see it in some of the drawings and paintings, which is what I shall go on to show. So Pirkheimer, not only those 3 pictures, but also he appears in these 2 famous engravings, which were just before the trip to. So he's on the right in the bathhouse, the men's bathhouse, where no washing is happening at all. The women's bathhouse, the equivalent one, there's lots of washing, everybody's attending to their washing, but the men no. And Pirkheimer is on the right-hand side drinking beer. He's that, and the mockery, it might almost be Dürer on the left-hand side, but look at the strategic placement of that tap. The tap, which has got a Hahn, Hahn is the word for tap, and it's got a cockerel on the top. I wanted to make it the triple, the 3 meanings of the word, but the word cock doesn't mean that in German at that stage, and it didn't mean that in English at that stage. It only appears in about 1800 or no 1700 in English. So I'm afraid I can't make it a 3-way sort of parody. But I think it's clear the kind of joke, the sense of fun that he has in these engravings. And then Pirkheimer is in the Apocalypse as well. He's down the bottom, one of the people being trampled on by the horse of famine, the one holding the scales. And here he is again in this. I shall concentrate quite a lot on this prayer book of Maximilian. Maximilian was, well, I'll probably come on to more about what it is later, but it's a prayer book that was printed on vellum. It's not handwritten, although it looks like it. And they printed 10 copies, and one of the copies has drawings by Dürer in a chunk of it, and drawings by Cranach in another section, and Altdorfer in another. He'd clearly employed these artists to add the decoration round the edge of the printing section, quite what he'd been aiming to do originally, because you can't actually reproduce that. So the assumption is that it was actually being used as a kind of a template for a later engraving, maybe. but he died, Maximilian died 1519 before this was ever completed. But that's clearly Pirkheimer again drinking from a complete jug. And he's being paired with Pan, the god Pan, a goat god of sort of, it reminds you of his thing in the letter about chasing after whores. But I would like to go back a little to sort of where I started. But the first journey to Venice was done in the 1490s, mid 1490s. And before that, this is getting slightly technical, but this is about the lute itself. Before that, that was a very medieval painting of, engraving of the lute. It is being held, supported by the forearm, and it's being played with a plectrum. And this is a medieval picture of a medieval lute. It seems as if Dürer hadn't come across the latest developments. He goes to Venice, and 2 years after returning from Venice that first time, he produces this astonishing silver point drawing. It's really wonderful. You can see the design of the quality of the drawing, that the interest in the human physique there is so different. The other is a sort of a cipher standing, and the interest is partly in the folds of the drapery in the first image, and yet the second one is entirely realistic picture of a man with wings holding a lute in the new modern fashion, played from, I wish you weren't quite so down behind, but played with the hand above, coming from above the lute, so you can't actually hold the lute up with your arm. So he's making a realistic statement about how the lute was played in this new modern, and it's a new modern lute, it's absolutely up to the date, Venetian lute. And he brings in this gigantic, great block of stone from the middle of nowhere to support an angel who could, of course, just fly, one presumes. But I think the joke behind it is what I want to emphasize. There he is, he's got a realism, and he wants to make a joke about it. Which leads on to another Emperor Maximilian prayer book entry, which is this lovely little angel, which again, the cherub can't play without putting his foot up on something. So he puts his foot up to have the knee to hold the lute properly, and he's putting his foot on a snail. As you probably know, and Dürer obviously did know, there was quite a tradition of snails and curious creatures in prayer books of this sort. The illustrations often surrounding them have snails and other sort of crazy creatures, marginalia. So here are some earlier. This is the Galston Psalter from near Norwich on the top left, the Metz Book of Hours, and then a French one, Livre du Trésor, and down the bottom, the Smithfield Decretals. But there was this strange thing about knights fighting snails. But I think there was a further joke. If I go back to the cherub, he's winking. And I think there's a further joke here going on, because at that time, the council in Nuremberg had commissioned a new tomb for their patron saint, Saint Sebaldus, to go in the Saint Sebaldus Kirche. And this was a giant undertaking. It was huge, a great casting being done by Fischer, and it hung about, not being completed, just like the prayer book was hanging about, not being completed. And lo and behold, the tomb is on 12 snails going round. If you go to the V&A, there's a full-size plaster cast of this thing, but it's in bronze. I mean, it's an absolute tour de force of bronze casting. But the snails, it was exactly at this moment when Dürer was doing 1515, when he was doing the illustration in Maximilian's prayer book, and this tomb was being. So I think the joke that the cherub was winking because of that. And to go on, or back to the drunkard again, in his, he produced a wonderful book at the end of his life, a manual for painters, Unterweisung der Messung, which is really an account of how to do perspective and all sorts of other constructions with compasses and pencil and ruler. And it's a massive and wonderful production. And it was 1525, just before he died. And in the course of it, he does various ceremonial pillars. And one of the ones he suggests is a pillar to commemorate a drunkard. And he suggests, if someone wanted to erect a memorial to a drunkard, and who could he have in mind? He might use the following suggestion. First, make the drunkard's casket, inscribed with an epitaph that mockingly praises his easy living. Place a beer barrel on top of that, covered by a board game, topped in turn by two bowls, which would hold a glutton's portion, and they are joined at their rims. At the bottom of the upper bowl, put a low beer mug with two handles, and over it a plate, which serves as the base for a high beer glass turned upside down. The entire structure is to be surmounted by a basket filled with bread, butter, and cheese. In this manner, but with other paraphernalia, one can decorate memorials according to the way of the life of a person being commemorated. For the sake of amusement, I wanted to explain this, and I've drawn it below as part of the section on columns. So it's a major scholarly work, and he puts this mad thing to a drunkard in it. And I think it was a major work commissioned by the Emperor Maximilian to decorate his prayer book, and he puts a drunkard in it. And here's another drunkard in the prayer book, just to complete the issue. But it clearly isn't Pirkheimer this time. He's too slim, too good looking. But he has his hose is broken open at the knee. And one of the things that comes out from you can see the complete digitized version of this prayer book in the State Gallery of the Munich, the Staatsgallery in Munich. And it's worth looking. It's quite, they're drawn in pen in different colored inks, and they're actually very faint. I've fiddled with these a bit to make them stand out a bit more, but they're quite hard to see. You do need to look quite carefully. The Bavarian State Gallery, sorry. One of the other pillars that he did this is in the book about a painter's manual, is this. I'll read it out because I think what I am coming to feel is that Dürer was, in spite of moving in these high-flown circles, he never lost the sense of what underpinned it and what ordinary people were like. He does seem to have had a real interest in the underdog in these illustrations. Quite a lot of the prayer book illustrations show the underclass, the drunkard, there's something else, the peasants fighting. And this is, if someone wants to erect a victory monument after vanquishing rebellious peasants. Now, this is 1525. There'd just been the Peasants' Revolt, in which 100,000, 300,000 peasants had been slaughtered by the nobility. And I can't help thinking that Dürer's sympathies were with the peasants. There has been some attempt to say, well, he was a friend of Luther, or not a friend, but he knew Luther, and he was a follower of Luther's doctrine. He was a convert, as it were. And Luther has a very vicious statement about the Peasants' Rebellion, which I'll come on to. And people have tended to say, oh, well, this monument is really just straight. But I don't think it is. I think this is mockery of the poor lot, or sympathizing with the lot of the peasants. I'll read his statement. If one wishes to erect a victory monument after vanquishing rebellious peasants, he might use the paraphernalia according to the following instructions. And then he describes this in detail. But notice how all the things are the things that provide life and food. They are the absolute necessities of living in a basic way. All the animals filled with butter, eggs, onions, herbs, or whatever you like. In the center, place a second one measuring 7 feet in length and 1 foot in height. Place a strong chest. Then place a kettle upside down on top of the chest. The kettle's diameter should be 4.5 feet. And so on, surmount the kettle with a cheese bowl, which is 1/2 foot high. On the plate, place a keg of butter, which is 3 foot high and has the diameter of 1.5 feet at the bottom and only 1 foot at the top. Its spout should protrude beyond this. On top of the butter keg, place a well-formed milk jug, 2.5 feet high. Into this jug, put 4 rods branching into forks on top and extending 5.5 feet in height, so that the rods will protrude by 1/2 foot, and then hang peasants' tools on it, like hoes, pitchforks, flails, etc. The rods are to be surmounted by a chicken basket, topped by a lard tub, upon which sits a sad, melancholy peasant with a sword stuck into his back. It cannot be other than sympathy. And when you see, I think I have, yes, right. I will go ahead there. His earlier drawing as part of his earlier engraving, part of the Small Passion, which he produced in 1511, shows exactly the same pose. I mean, it is precisely, all the limbs are in the same position. He cannot but be thinking of that, I think, when he's done the peasant, the sword in his back. So this is the Peasants' Rebellion, and the 12 articles, with the very Christian kind of things, the medieval writings and so on. This is the Peasants' Revolt in 1525, or it came to a crescendo in 1525. And then Luther, down at the bottom, wrote a pamphlet against the robbing, murderous hordes of peasants. And he encouraged the nobility to swiftly and violently eliminate the rebelling peasants, saying, the peasants must be sliced, choked, stabbed secretly and publicly by those who can, like one must kill a rabid dog. I think Luther doesn't come out very well out of that. And it seems to me that Dürer does. He seems to have a more humane view of the matter than that. Luther did also produce a booklet against beggars, which described how beggars are constantly cheating you and all the various ways in which they can deceive you and get alms and they shouldn't do. So he has a kind of a distinct air of the status quo about Luther. And these is the Bundschuh movement, which is sort of around about the same time as the, it was a movement that, it's an earlier version of the Peasants' Rebellion, really, and it was rather scattered and was more easily put down. But you can see that Dürer's got one of his prayer book illustrations looks remarkably like. And the Dürer illustrations in the prayer book are mostly signed with his monogram and dated 1515. So it will have been almost exactly the time when the peasants, the Bundschuh movement was going on and very noticeable in southern Germany. And as part of the sense of him being grounded and interested in the production of food and the reality of the peasant's life and the necessity of it. Here is this wonderful farmer's wife with cheese in one hand, all her keys, eggs and butter, everything about it indicating the sort of production of food. And she's standing on a pomegranate, which is the symbol of fertility and life. But there's that curious, what's she doing with a swan on her head? It's all very odd, but it looks like our towers, the pillars. It's got that kind of pillar-like quality to it. And I think he's mocking the nobility. Their swans on heraldic crests were quite the thing. And so he's turned our peasant woman into a heraldic nobility. He's given her nobility. There's lots of swan crests. I've picked the two that are most similar. And so I think that a sort of sense that although he was moving in these high circles, he had a very subversive eye on a lot of these things. And I'd like to follow with another grand thing. He was commissioned by Emperor Maximilian. I mean, Emperor Maximilian met him in Nuremberg and commissioned him in 1512 to do this grand cart, the triumphal wagon, which was to be the centerpiece of the Maximilian's triumph, which you may know about, a huge, great thing that was about 170 feet long. It was supposed to be pasted round city halls and things, copies of it, as an evidence of his power. Again, it never got done, but the Maximilian triumph is the woodcuts are there, but this was supposed to be the centerpiece of it, and Dürer did this. Note the huge number of horses pulling this grand triumphal wagon, and here is more or less the same thing as part of the much better known Maximilian's triumph. This is the musicians. This was actually done not by Dürer, but by Buchmeyer, and Buchmeyer produced a colored version, which is in Spain. I put that one in. It's the same set of musicians. They're actually named Artus, the Maximilian's chief lutenist. But I was interested in the animals. They're all grand and wonderful, stags and oxen. And then Dürer does, in a prayer book, he does this, which is, the prayer book is contra potentes, against the mighty is the text. And it looks very similar to those grand wagons. It's even got those strange heavy wheels, and it's being pulled by a goat. This is the mighty being led by their goatish qualities, by the forces of darkness. I mean, basically, it's a kind of devilish reference, and all overseen by the recording angel on the top. sort of expressing horror, but it seems to be again undercutting what might be regarded as his sort of central noble pictures and the engravings he'd done for powerful people. And yet it was on a Maximilian prayer book. He was promoting a fantasy chivalric order called the Order of St. George, Maximilian, and the Knights of St. George that were all each supposed to get one of these prayer books. He had the special typeface cut to represent to be equivalent to a hand-lettered thing, and 10 copies were printed on vellum, and only one was illustrated by Dürer. So we don't know, and it's not entirely sure if Maximilian ever saw the copy that Dürer illustrated. So it's, I wonder if he would have felt that it was sort of undercutting him rather. It must have been quite a daring move to do this, I think. Maybe Dürer knew he'd never see it. And then to go back to the painter's manual, one of his interests is how to do perspective. And there's a whole series of perspective ones. This was interesting to me because it's a lute. I mean, it's an impossible machine, but it shows you the principle behind a certain idea of perspective, how you get a perspective. Imagine actually doing this. You're flapping the thing open. You'll get your attendant to put the pointer on the lute, and then you're supposed to put 2 strings from the frame to cross at the point where the string is. Then you take the cord away, you close the frame, and you put a dot there. You can see the door closed. So you've got your lute identified by a series of dots. But it's an impossible. Nobody would ever do this. It's just, in a way, symbolic of the idea. And he did several equivalent drawings, which are schematic, really, rather than anything else. That's another one where you have a sight line from the point of view is the hook in the wall. That's what you're creating. And there was another one there, which he says in the book, for those who want to do a portrait but are not confident enough of their ability to get it right, I suggest this method. And there's the potentate. It might be Maximilian sitting there in all his pomp, and with this machine to enable him to draw perspective. But what I wanted to do, the whole thing is then undercut by this wonderful one, which didn't appear in the first edition of the Painter's Manual, but did in one that was produced just after his death, 1528. But the drawing was, they've labelled it, as was done by Dürer while he was on this earth. And here it is. And isn't that wonderfully funny? I mean, remembering that strategically placed tap early on, the phallic nature of that pointer, and the exuberant life on the left-hand side, and the dour, staring artist on the right-hand side. This is funny, and it's just glorious. And the sort of the horizon line too emphasizes the straightness of his look, the horizon line behind. And typically with Dürer, there's a sort of bonsai tree on the windowsill as well. It's all sort of beautifully done and observed, but the exuberant life that's lying on the other side of the screen, I think it's just so very funny. So I'm more or less coming, I don't know if I have timed it about right. This is my last image, which is one of the very famous, absolutely wonderful, wonderful engravings. The way he's managed to get the texture of the flesh and the skin against the darkness of the woods and the trees and everything else, it's just magnificent. magnificent. And you'd think, well, that's it. It's glorious. But look, up in the top right-hand corner is that crazy goat just stuck out on the top of a precipice with nowhere to go. It cannot be anything other than funny. He's just done it. It's there right at the top. And I mean, you wouldn't really look at it. I went to an exhibition in Italy where they'd got a copy of this engraving and various others, and I just burst out laughing when I saw it. It's just so glorious. So that's really what I wanted to say. Underneath Dürer's he's reverenced around the world and in Germany as the great German artist. And yet underneath there's a very human, very grounded person who's anxious, constantly making jokes and looking carefully and seeing what I think we would say was a very humane view of the world. So that's the end.
Oh, roving microphone. Thank you very much, David. That was a terrific talk, and it's wonderful to know about jokes being made 500 years ago,
yes,
still amusing us today. It's incredible. We tend to look at art history with a very serious
yes,
aspect
exactly
most of the time.
Yes,
you brought out some wonderful examples of great wit from a bygone age this evening. So thank you very much. Most interesting. His little signature is also something that has always amused me. The A and the D
yes,
between the legs. It's
yes,
very no signature of that time surely existed like that. A logo in a sense.
yes, absolutely. He was they were a Hungarian family originally, and I've forgotten the Hungarian word, but they had a Hungarian name, meant door. And so they adopted the word Dürer as very close to Dürer. So, and his the workshop sign featured some doors, and I think that D, the A, looks like a doorway. Yes,
fascinating.
With the D coming through it.
Yeah, a man who had a sense of his own image in a way.
Yes, yes, yes.
And his look as well, with that wonderful long hair that he always had, which in a sense must have been slightly subversive itself.
I think so, yes. One of them is definitely posing as a Christ figure. He's even got the Redeemer's sort of hand gesture here with the two fingers like that. And the lute player in the Rosencrantz picture also has two fingers like that, which is not a way you can play the lute. So it's designed to be, he seems to associate that with reverent piety.
Yes. That was a figure of Christ sitting down in the sort of thinker pose.
Yes.
Imitate, so with the hands in the feet and
yes.
Yeah.
It was part of the Small Passion series.
So imagine the crucified Christ sitting down in a thoughtful position.
It's Man of Sorrows. It's just, yes, that's right. Yes. I hadn't, yes, it's right. It is after the crucifixion because of the
hands of
the stigmata.
Yes. Now, I don't know if anyone would like to ask questions of David after this wonderful talk. If you do, please raise your hand, and I'll use this roving mic to approach people.
Yes, if anybody online wishes to ask a question.
And are there any online, Emma?
We have 14.
No, I mean, are there any questions in the chat?
So far. So I'll use himself.
Yeah. Good. So, questions from the floor? I think you seem to have covered everything, David.
Well.
Oh, yes, please.
Use the logo.
Yes.
Do you think jokes or do you think he wanted the audience to see them?
I think some of them must have been public, that engraving with the strategically placed tap must have been public, must have been obvious to anybody who looked at it without sort of, and some of them were private, putting Pirkheimer in the Apocalypse, being stamped on by Famine's horse, I think was probably private. And probably the drunkard at the bottom of the prayer book will have been private Pirkheimer. Pirkheimer wrote Dürer dedicated his Painter's Manual, the book that I've been referring to Pirkheimer in very fulsome terms. It was really touching, saying, I don't want to show off by producing this book, but I want to show that I value and respect our friendship. It was a very nice sort of not pompous dedication. It was very, very good.
Engraving by its nature anyway is meant to be reprinted and multiplied, and so you wouldn't know who was going to see the images. If it's just one painting in a castle or a gallery, of course you could be private in a sense, but engraving is going to be reproduced.
Yes, and indeed, I mean, he makes the point in that letter to Pirkheimer about how he would have earned much more had he spent his time engraving. He was very early on with an early adopter of the new technology of engraving and printing. So he was very successful at spreading his images all over Europe.
Yeah.
They're everywhere. I mean, the example of the Pirkheimer bookplate one at the end is from the Royal Collection in London.
Yeah.
They're all over the place. The British Museum have them. Everybody.
Of course, we forget, I suppose. Well, I was just about to say that I had done, but technology of printing is only just prior to him creating these woodcuts.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So he's using the technology of printing words straight away to be able to reproduce images.
Yes,
away.
yes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the prayer book is, as it were, it's trying to reproduce hand lettered books of ours.
Imo, come on, let's use the tech.
Yes, in your synopsis for this talk, you alluded to the fact that Dürer would have had to be quite politically astute to stay just the right side of the law. And I noticed that the dates predate mostly the Reformation in Germany, and some of the works came after.
Yes.
So was he at any stage in danger of falling into the clutches of the Inquisition?
I don't think so. No. There was a widespread criticism of the church anyway. I mean, he was actually a friend of Erasmus, and Pirkheimer was a much closer friend of Erasmus. Pirkheimer was employed by the emperor to write the emperor's autobiography by dictation. So he was right in the center of things, and there was this anti-abuses feeling which was spreading all over Europe, which Luther picked up on. The difference was that Erasmus and others didn't want to break the church. They wanted the church to reform. But Dürer did actually join. I think he felt that Luther's theological answer gave him some comforts, because it was a kind of Luther's theology really answered the questions that a devout Catholic might worry about, salvation and so on. If you took Catholicism ever so seriously, it gave rise to anxiety. And Luther's theology was a way of answering that doubt. So my own view is that you couldn't really be a proper Lutheran or Protestant until you'd actually been a Catholic and had the worries. And it's noticeable in English Reformation work. They then have to have catechisms to induce the worry that then they will answer. So Luther, I think, felt some of those worries and felt that, Dürer had some of those worries and felt that Luther did answer those. And he wanted Erasmus to come on board with Luther, but Erasmus never did. And they didn't quite see eye to eye, I think. In fact, Erasmus didn't like Dürer's drawings of him, his portraits of him. And the suggestion is that he saw too clearly Erasmus's sort of hesitancies and doubts and sort of double thinking, ironies. Yes.
Yes, sir. Shall I bring the mic? Come on.
We must have the technology.
Not really a question, but more a comment that I was intrigued with the pillars that you drew, and I was reminded of the works of Heath Robinson in the 20th century.
Yes.
He also sort of tried to puncture sort of people.
Yes, yes.
Bureaucracy.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Could I ask you about the lutes? What was the role of the lute in music at that time?
It was the equivalent of the 19th century and the piano. It was a very portable, polyphonic instrument that you could pick up and move about and play. And it was absolutely central to musical life for 300 years. It was really very, very important indeed. The trouble was, for later historians, until moderately recently, it was written in a special tablature, which was unreadable by most ordinary musicians. It just told you where to put your fingers on the strings and then pluck them. So it looked like code. And in fact, there's a funny story that one of the main researchers in it was Diana Poulton, and she was in correspondence with, oh goodness, the man's name's gone out of my head.
Robert Spencer?
No. He was the Moscow. He was the British attaché in Moscow, and they were swapping tablature between them, and the CIA got very interested because they thought it was code. And Diana Poulton was a noted communist, I should say. Yeah. So she was, I've forgotten his, Colonel Prynne. That's right, Colonel Prynne. So Colonel Prynne was a researcher and really quite important as well, but he came under suspicion. But it was absolutely central. And the thing was, it was a huge industry. The Germans working in southern Germany and in northern Italy, between them, controlled pretty well the whole of this. They ran it as a closed shop. They had a kind of interesting intermarriage thing whereby they would send their sons to be apprentices to their rival makers, their fellow makers, and the apprentices would be younger. The makers would die, their widow would marry the younger apprentice, and so on. And you got interlocking generations like that. So each person got two goes. The older man got a younger woman, and then the woman who lived on got a younger apprentice, and so on. And it kept it within the German community, really quite, and I think there was an air of secrecy as well, keeping the guild secrets going, because it was one of the first industries to form a guild. And it was very economically important. It was huge quantities of instruments. When I did work on the quantities, it was millions and millions of yew trees were used. That and the arms industry destroyed European stands of yew trees pretty well forever. They've never recovered. Sorry, you wanted, I think. Did you not? Oh, sorry.
Well, I think that's a good time to draw things to a conclusion here, and we can repair to the back of the church to continue discussions, if we wish, for a glass of wine and some cake, as is the norm here at these talks. I'll just add a personal note to what David has said. I have known David for 50 years. and I'm a lute player, and the two lutes that I own, David made, and they are, I have no hesitation in saying they are my most prized possessions, apart from the living things that I live with in the house. And the largest of them is by Magnus Tiefenbrücker, who you mentioned, David, one of these Germans who emigrated south to Italy to make his trade there, and Heber, the first lute, both German manufacturers.
Yes.
So it's very much a German tradition, and in keeping with this building, German migrant workers around Europe, German migrant workers here. You've come out this evening to a German Lutheran church and heard distinct criticism of Martin Luther.
Yes.
But this is a very fair society of St. George's talks. There's nothing next month, no talk in August, but in September you will have a chance, or we will have a chance, to redress the balance by coming here on Tuesday the 17th of September to sing our favourite German Lutheran hymn. That is the next event on the St. George's Talks calendars. We have a conductor here who arrives every December to lead carol services, and he in September is going to take those of us who wish to come and sing favourite Lutheran hymns. Nun danke alle Gott. The Ein feste Burg, which is the great Lutheran hymn, and Wachet auf, which is the theme tune of Lloyd's Bank, and famous as a Baccarat. So it would be wonderful if those of you who are here this evening were to come along to that, and of course those of you who are online and still present. So thank you all very much this evening for coming. Please join us now for a drink at the back, and thank you especially to David Van Edwards for his wonderful talk. So thank you.